The vote passed at 3:14 in the morning station time. Merc Solis didn't learn about it until 6 hours later, when he woke to find that his security clearance had already been revoked. His personal communicator had been reduced to a single outbound channel, emergency medical only. And the door to his quarters, which had never been locked in 4 years aboard the Meridian Accord station, now required a code he hadn't been given. He stood at that door for a long time. Not because he couldn't think of what to do, but because he was trying to understand what it meant that the lock was there at all. The Accord didn't do things by accident. Every procedural step was deliberate, documented, filed in triplicate across 7 archiving systems. Someone had decided he should know, before anything else, that he no longer had freedom of movement. That was the first message, and they had delivered it while he slept. He sat back down on the edge of his bunk and thought about that. Outside the station's observation ports, if he could have reached them, he would have seen something unprecedented in 400 years of interstellar diplomacy. 23 Allied fleet formations holding position in concentric arcs around Earth's solar system. Not in aggressive formation, not with weapons charged, just present. The way a wall is present, the way a closed door is present. The quorum of aligned species had spent 11 months building to this moment, and now that it had arrived, they were being very careful about what it looked like. It looked like a quarantine. It was something else entirely. Merc didn't know that yet, but he knew something was wrong in a way that went deeper than politics, deeper than the diplomatic failure he'd spent the last 18 months trying to prevent. He knew it the way a person knows when a building has changed weight, when the structure around them is bearing a different kind of load than they were designed to carry. He was 43 years old. He had spent 14 years as Earth's primary cultural liaison to the Accord, which meant he had spent 14 years being the human in the room who was expected to translate not language but instinct, to explain to 17 alien civilizations why human beings did the things they did, felt the things they felt, made the decisions that, from the outside, appeared to be simply and completely irrational. He had been very good at that job. He was not sure, sitting on the edge of his bunk with a locked door in front of him, whether that mattered anymore. 3 months before the vote, Ambassador Thesson of the Velori Compact had made what she considered a straightforward observation. The Velori were among the oldest member species of the Accord, their civilization having achieved stable multi-system governance roughly 4,000 years before humanity learned to write. They were not arrogant in the way that younger, powerful species sometimes were. They were simply very accustomed to understanding how things worked. Thesson had been reviewing the economic impact projections of the reclamation proposal, the Accord's plan to formally revoke humanity's Tier 3 membership status and return Earth to supervised development, and something in the numbers had caught her attention. "They're accelerating," she said, to no one in particular, in her private chambers. She called her senior analyst, Vorin, who arrived within minutes and studied the data for longer than Thesson would have expected. "The manufacturing surge began 8 months ago," Vorin said finally, "before the preliminary discussions were public." "Before they were public to them," Thesson corrected. Vorin's secondary eyelids, the translucent ones, the ones that indicated genuine unease rather than social courtesy, flickered once. "You believe they knew?" Thesson didn't answer immediately. She was thinking about something Merc Solis had said to her once, almost casually, at a reception where he'd had slightly too much of the Velori ceremonial drink that affected humans differently than it affected Velori. He had said, "We're very good at reading rooms," and she had smiled because it was a quaint human expression, and moved on, and had not thought about it again until this moment. "I believe," she said slowly, "that we may have fundamentally misunderstood how humans receive information. The manufacturing surge wasn't just in military hardware, which would have been obvious, expected, and containable. It was in food preservation systems, desalination infrastructure, underground hydroponic networks on a scale that Earth's population didn't require, long-term biological storage, medical cold chain equipment rated for 50-year operational lifespans, communication relay hardware designed to function without satellite infrastructure. These were not the preparations of a civilization expecting to win a confrontation. These were the preparations of a civilization expecting to lose one and planning to survive it anyway. And that distinction, Thesson would later testify, was the thing they had failed entirely to understand. What the Accord believed they were doing was simple, clean, and by their own institutional logic, entirely humane. Humanity had been granted Tier 3 membership status 41 years ago on the basis of certain demonstrated capacities, technological development trajectory, resource management, diplomatic stability. In the decades since, Earth had met some of those benchmarks and quietly, consistently failed others. Not catastrophically, not in ways that constituted a threat, just in ways that suggested the original assessment had been optimistic. The reclamation proposal argued that humanity wasn't ready, that the tools of galactic citizenship, FTL access, Accord economic networks, advanced manufacturing licenses, were accelerating human development in ways that were creating systemic instability, that the kindest thing to do was to pause the relationship, establish a supervised development framework, and revisit membership in another century or two. The language was careful. The language was compassionate. The language had been crafted by species who genuinely believed they were being responsible. Merck had read the proposal 9 months ago. He had read it 4 times in one sitting, and then he had not said a single word about it to anyone for 3 days. His colleague and only real friend aboard the station, Dr. Una Park, who handled xenobiological liaison and had a habit of noticing things people wished she wouldn't, had found him on the 4th day. "You look like someone died," she said. "Not yet," he said, and immediately changed the subject, and she let him, because she understood without him saying it that there were some realizations a person needed to carry alone for a while before they could speak them aloud. What Merck had understood in those 3 days of silence was not what the proposal said. It was what the proposal revealed about how the Accord saw humanity. They saw a species that could be paused. A civilization that could be set aside, waiting, for a century or two, like a project that needed more development time, and that would still be there when the Accord decided to return to it. They saw something that could be contained without being destroyed. Something that would accept the containment because the containment was framed as care. They had looked at 41 years of human behavior within the Accord framework and had seen exactly what they expected to see. A young species, somewhat volatile, somewhat promising, doing its best within systems designed by older and more stable minds. They had not seen what was also there. They had not understood what humans do when they decide, quietly and without announcement, that the official situation is no longer the real situation. Merck was still sitting on his bunk when the door chimed. Not unlocked chimed, which meant someone on the other side had requested entry through the new access protocol, which meant someone on the other side had the code he didn't have. The door opened. Vorin, Thesson's analyst, stood in the corridor. He looked like he hadn't slept. Merck wasn't sure Valori slept the way humans did, but whatever the equivalent was, Vorin had clearly been deprived of it. "Ambassador Thesson would like to speak with you," Vorin said. "I assumed," Merck said. "Is she planning to give me the code to my own door?" Vorin's secondary eyelids flickered. "That was an error in the implementation protocol, it has been noted." "I'm sure it has," Merck said and stood and followed him. The corridor was different than he remembered. Not physically, the station hadn't changed overnight, but the quality of attention in it had shifted. Accord security personnel who normally moved through their duties with the particular looseness of people doing a job they understood were now moving with a different quality of focus. Careful, alert to something they couldn't quite identify. Merck noticed this and filed it away. He also noticed, as they passed the secondary observation gallery, that the fleet formations outside had changed configuration. Not dramatically, not in any way that would register on a casual scan. But he had spent 14 years watching Accord fleet positioning, and the change was there. The inner arc had tightened by approximately 12 degrees. They were closer than they'd been this morning. He didn't say anything. Thesson's office occupied a curved section of the station's upper diplomatic ring, with a view of space that on any normal day was quietly, neutrally beautiful. Today it looked different. Through the viewport, Earth's sun was a small, warm point of light amid the darker geometry of the fleet formations, and the effect was of something precious surrounded by something that had decided to be unmovable. Thesson looked at him for a long moment before she spoke. This was unusual. Velori diplomats were trained to speak within the first breath of any meeting. Silence for them was a form of aggression. "You're not surprised," she said finally. "By which part?" "By any of it." Merrick sat down without being invited to, which was also unusual but felt appropriate. "I'm surprised by the timeline," he said. "I expected another 4 months of procedural review. The Accord generally doesn't move this quickly." "We had new information." He waited. She said, "The manufacturing data, the infrastructure preparation." Someone in the council interpreted it as evidence that humanity was preparing a preemptive response to the proposal, and the decision was made to accelerate implementation before that response could materialize. "And what do you think it was evidence of?" She was quiet for long enough that Vorin, standing near the wall, shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. "I think," Thesson said, "that it was evidence of something we don't have a framework for." "Tell me your framework," Merrick said. "The one you've been using. The one the council used." She folded her hands in the Velori gesture that meant I am about to say something that costs me something. "We believed that if we removed humanity's access to Accord resources and systems, the effect would be disruptive but manageable. A return to the development trajectory Earth was on before contact. Uncomfortable, certainly, but not catastrophic. Humans had built a functional civilization before they met us. The assumption was that the same capacities would allow them to maintain a functional civilization without us." "That's a reasonable assumption," Merrick said. "Yes," she said, "which is what concerns me." He looked at her. "We are very good," she said carefully, "at making reasonable assumptions. We have 4,000 years of experience identifying what is reasonable. And I am sitting here looking at the data from Earth's last 8 months of preparation, and I cannot make it fit any framework I understand, because I cannot identify what outcome they are preparing for." "What outcomes have you ruled out?" "Conventional resistance. The scale is wrong for a military response, and the nature of the infrastructure doesn't support offensive capability. Economic isolation. They're not building towards self-sufficiency in the ways that would indicate a long-term trade-independent strategy. Immigration. There's no evidence of off-world colony preparation significant enough to account for a meaningful population transfer." She paused. "We've ruled out every outcome we can model." Merrick said nothing. "What are they preparing for, Ambassador Solis?" He looked at the viewport, the fleet formations, the small warm light of his sun. "I think," he said, "you should ask yourself a different question." "Which question?" "Not what outcome they're preparing for." He turned back to her. "What are they preparing to survive?" The room was very quiet. Vorin's secondary eyelids stayed shut for a long time. When they opened, he said very quietly to no one in particular, "That's not the same question." "No," Merrick agreed. "It's not." Here is what the Accord's intelligence analysis had not accounted for, because it was not the kind of thing that appeared in data. 6 weeks after the reclamation proposal's existence became known, through channels that were never officially identified, via a leak that the Accord's internal review concluded was impossible given their security architecture, and then quietly stopped investigating. A woman in Osaka named Riku Tanaka had gathered 11 of her neighbors in her apartment and said, without drama, without ceremony, "I think we should talk about what comes next. Not what we should do about it, not how to stop it. What comes next?" The conversation had lasted 9 hours. By the end of it, the 11 people in that apartment had each personally contacted 17 more people, and those conversations were already happening. Not online, not in any medium that Accord monitoring systems would flag as organized resistance communication, because they were not organized resistance communication. They were conversations. The specific kind of conversation humans have when they've understood, collectively, and without formal announcement, that official systems are no longer the systems that matter. The Accord had spent 11 months preparing a political and military framework for removing humanity's power within their structure. They had not spent any of those months considering what humans would build in the space left behind. Merrick knew about Riku Tanaka. Not because he'd organized anything, not because there was an organization to know about, but because he understood the way information moved through human networks, and because 6 months ago Unipark had mentioned, as though commenting on the weather, that her sister in Fukuoka had been attending a lot of community dinners lately. Just that sentence. And Merrick had nodded and understood everything that had not been said, and had not said any of it himself. This was the thing the Accord had never fully modeled, not the information, but the way humans transmitted it. The way an entire species could shift into a different operational mode without any formal coordination, without any chain of command, without any document that could be intercepted or any meeting that could be monitored, because the coordination was happening in the space between words, in the assumptions shared between people who understood each other in ways that had been built over tens of thousands of years of navigating exactly this kind of situation. Humans had survived ice ages, civilizational collapse, plagues that killed half a continent, occupations that lasted centuries. They had developed over that entire span of time a very specific skill set that had never been the focus of the Accord's assessment protocols, because the Accord's assessment protocols were designed to evaluate civilizations under normal developmental conditions, not civilizations under pressure. What humans do under pressure was not what they did under normal conditions. This was the thing Thesson was beginning to understand, sitting across from Merrick Solis with the fleet formations visible through her viewport, and it was making her very, very careful. "I need to ask you something directly," she said. "All right. And I need you to understand that this is not a negotiation. The vote has passed. The implementation framework is active. I am not in a position to reverse it, and neither is anyone on this station. I understand. What is Earth waiting for?" Merrick considered the question, not because he didn't know how to answer it, because he was deciding how much truth the answer required. "Thesson," he said, "have you ever heard the human word fallow?" She had not. "It's an agricultural term. When you have a field that you've been farming intensively, you sometimes let it rest. You don't plant anything. You let the soil recover. You let the root systems that were suppressed by cultivation re-establish themselves. And when you return to farming it, the field is more productive than it was before you stopped." She looked at him. "We're not waiting for anything," he said. "We're not executing a plan. There's no command structure, no countdown, no signal. You're asking the wrong question again." "Then what is the right question? What happens to a species that has been partially outsourcing its survival instincts to an external system for 41 years, when that external system is suddenly removed?" The silence was longer this time. "Withdrawal," Voron said quietly from the wall. "You're describing." "I'm describing adaptation," Merrick said, "which is different. Withdrawal implies the organism was dependent on something it needed to stop needing. Adaptation implies the organism encounters a new environment and responds accordingly." He paused. "Humans are very good at responding to new environments. We've been doing it for a long time. What we're not particularly good at, what the Accord may have misunderstood as a stability problem, is pretending a new environment is the old one when it isn't." Thesson's hands unfolded from their diplomatic posture and rested flat on the desk. He'd never seen her do that before. He wasn't sure what it meant in Valori body language, but the effect was of a person who had just stopped performing composure. "You're saying the manufacturing surge isn't preparation," she said. "You're saying it's already the response." "I'm saying it started the day after the first human being understood what was happening," Merrick said, "however that understanding arrived, and that it will not stop because a vote passed or because a fleet is in position or because my door now has a lock on it. Those things are real and they have consequences and they matter, but they matter the way weather matters. You prepare for weather. You don't negotiate with it." She looked at him for a very long time. "You're not frightened," she said. There was something in her voice that he couldn't quite classify, not accusation, something closer to recognition. "I'm frightened of quite a lot of things," he said honestly. "I'm frightened for the people who are going to have the hardest time with the next few years. I'm frightened that some of the things we've been building are going to go wrong in ways we haven't anticipated. I'm frightened that the Accord may interpret some of what happens next as aggression, and that interpretation could make things more dangerous for everyone." He paused. "I'm frightened that you may decide, based on what I'm telling you, that you need to tighten the containment, and that you may do it in ways that make the situation worse rather than better. But not of the situation itself. The situation is what it is. Being frightened of what's already true doesn't do anything useful." Thesson was quiet for a moment that extended until it became something else. "My species," she said at last, "went through a period roughly 3,000 years ago that our historians refer to as the Consolidation. During the Consolidation, the 7 major Valori governmental systems were unified under a single administrative framework. It was not entirely voluntary for all parties. Some systems resisted." She paused. Resistance lasted between 11 and 40 years per system, depending on the depth of the cultural infrastructure that had to be dismantled. By the end of it, the systems that had resisted most strenuously had the lowest survival rates among the indigenous cultural forms. The ones that complied earliest preserved the most. "I know the history," Merck said. "Then you understand what I'm telling you. You're telling me you're using a successful framework. I'm telling you the framework works." He nodded slowly. "Thesson, how many of those 7 systems had, before the Consolidation, survived the equivalent of the last ice age on their own?" She said nothing. "How many of them had spent 50,000 years developing the cognitive architecture to function without centralized support, not as a choice, as a requirement for species survival?" He kept his voice level. "You have a very good framework. It has worked on every civilization you've applied it to. I'm not telling you it doesn't work. I'm telling you," he stopped. "I'm telling you that you may be about to discover that you have not actually worked on a civilization like us before." The fleet outside held its position. The formations didn't move. And yet Merck had the sudden, very specific sense that someone, somewhere in that fleet, was becoming aware that holding position and having control of a situation were not the same thing. What happened over the next 71 days was not a rebellion. This is the thing the Accord's historians would later spend decades trying to convey accurately, and would largely fail at, because they did not have a framework for what it was. It was not organized. There was no central resistance network, no unified human government operating in the shadows, no secret military command. The Accord's intelligence apparatus spent those 71 days searching for the structure that must exist, because organized behavior requires organizational structure, and what they observed was clearly organized, or appeared organized, or at least had coherent outcomes, and those coherent outcomes had to come from somewhere. They were coming from 50,000 years of practice. In the Hokkaido region of northern Japan, a network of communities supported agricultural collectives that had been dormant for 30 years reactivated, quietly, and within 6 weeks had established food security for a population of 200,000 people, entirely outside of Accord-linked supply chains. No announcement. No coordination visible from outside. One person had called another person, and that person had called someone else, and at some point, the critical mass of people who remembered how to do the thing had assembled around the thing and begun doing it. In the Baltic region, 3 separate engineering teams, unconnected, operating without knowledge of each other, independently arrived at near-identical designs for microgrid energy infrastructure that could operate without the manufacturing licenses the Accord had now revoked. The designs circulated through informal networks at a speed that the Accord's monitoring systems, calibrated for typical human information propagation, consistently underestimated by a factor of 6. In Lagos, in Sao Paulo, in Chennai, in dozens of cities where the Accord's economic withdrawal was expected to hit hardest, community structures that had been present all along, structures the Accord's development metrics had classified as pre-modern holdovers, evidence of incomplete integration, turned out to be exactly the things that kept those populations from experiencing the crisis the withdrawal was supposed to create. The crisis was real. Merck was not telling Thesson a comfortable story. There was genuine hardship, genuine suffering, genuine failure in places where the infrastructure wasn't there and couldn't be built fast enough. The Accord had not been wrong that the withdrawal would be painful. It was painful, but pain was not collapse. And the Accord's models had been built on the assumption that for a species at Earth's level of Accord integration, significant pain would produce collapse. It was producing something else. Every 72 hours, Merck received a summary report from Accord monitoring systems, which still functioned and still had access to Earth observation, because the reclamation protocol included an ongoing assessment requirement. He read each one carefully. He looked for the data points the Accord analysts were weighting most heavily, and then he looked for the data points they weren't weighting because they didn't know to weight them. He found the same pattern every time. The analysts were watching the systems. They were watching what Earth had built, and how much of it was functional, and what percentage of pre-withdrawal capacity was being maintained. They were measuring the gap and expecting the gap to grow. They were not watching what was happening in the gap. They were not watching what humans were building in spaces that had not previously had structures in them, because the assessment framework assumed that absence of established structure was equivalent to absence of function. It was not. On day 47, Merck requested a second meeting with Thesson and showed her a specific data set she hadn't seen. The correlation between the regions the Accord's models predicted would have the highest hardship and the regions showing the most significant spontaneous infrastructure generation. The harder the withdrawal hit, he said, the faster the response. She looked at the data for a long time. That's not possible, Voron said. He wasn't arguing. He sounded like someone who had encountered a physical fact that contradicted a law of physics and was describing the experience. Resource-deprived systems don't generate at higher rates under stress. That violates basic developmental economics. It violates Valori developmental economics, Merck said, and Cathari developmental economics, and Sulan developmental economics, and the economics of every species the Accord has developed its frameworks from. He paused. I'd like to suggest that it does not violate human developmental economics. That can't be Voron stopped. A real distinction, Merck offered. Voron's secondary eyelids were doing something Merck hadn't seen them do before, opening and closing at irregular intervals, like a system trying to process something and cycling back to reprocess it. We assumed, Voron said slowly, that stress was a uniform input. That its effect on development would be a function of magnitude, not of, he trailed off, not of species, Thesson finished. She was looking at the data with an expression Merck had never seen on a Valori face before, not the polite diplomatic concern he was accustomed to, something rower. We assumed stress behaved the same way across civilizations. It's a reasonable assumption, Merck said gently, most of the time. How long have you known this? She asked. The question surprised him. I'm sorry. How long have humans known this about themselves? He thought about it honestly. We've known the anecdote for a very long time. Civilizations in crisis generating unexpected creative and social output. It's documented across almost all of our written history. We have words for it in most of our languages. He paused. What we didn't know until fairly recently was the mechanism, why it happens. What it is about the combination of social bonding, stress response, and temporal cognition in humans that produces this instead of what your models predict. And now you know. We have some theories, he said carefully. She looked at him for a long time. You didn't share this, she said, not an accusation, an observation with weight. No one asked. We asked many questions about human development in the assessment process. You asked questions that fit your framework, he said. We answered them accurately. I'm not suggesting we were deliberately opaque, Thesson. I'm suggesting that the questions you knew how to ask were shaped by what you already knew, and what you already knew was built from species whose stress response looks like yours. When we described our history and our behavior under pressure, you categorized it as volatility, as instability, as evidence of insufficient developmental maturity. He kept his voice even. You were measuring us with a scale built for a different kind of animal. The silence after this was the longest one yet. When Thesson spoke, her voice had a quality he'd never heard in it before, something that sounded, improbably, like the beginning of fear. What are you telling me is happening on Earth right now? I'm telling you, he said, that 71 days ago, you removed the structure you believed Earth's population was dependent on. And I'm telling you that what you are watching is what happens when you take that structure away from a species that spent 50,000 years building its own before you arrived. He looked at her steadily. I'm telling you Earth isn't in a crisis. Earth is in a very uncomfortable, very painful, and very productive restructuring. And I'm telling you that the longer the fleet holds position, and the longer the containment framework stays in place, the more thoroughly that restructuring will complete itself. Because the thing about humans under pressure is that we do not slow down. We get very focused, and we get very creative, and we get very determined. And those things do not turn off when the pressure becomes extreme. They scale with the pressure. Thesson stood up. She walked to the viewport. She looked at the fleet formations and at the small, warm light of Earth's sun for a very long time. We thought, she said very quietly, that we were removing your power. I know, Merck said. We thought we were protecting the galaxy from a species that wasn't ready. I know. Ambassador Solis. She didn't turn around. What did we actually do? And here he was careful, because this was the question he had been carrying for 14 years, the one he had shaped his entire diplomatic career around the edges of, the one he had never been able to fully answer because the full answer was the kind of thing that changed the nature of a relationship permanently once it was said aloud. You created the conditions, he said, under which humans had to remember who they were before you got here. She turned around. Her face was doing something he couldn't interpret, not fear exactly, not anger, something more like the expression of a person who has been shown that the map they navigated by was missing an entire continent. And who were you, she said, before we got here? Survivors, he said. That's all, just survivors, of things that should have killed us, over and over again. For so long that surviving things that should kill you stopped feeling like an emergency and started feeling like, he searched for the word, like Tuesday. On day 93, the Accord Council convened an emergency session. On day 94, Merck received a request, not a summons, a request for his assessment of current Earth conditions and projected stability trajectory. He spent 2 days writing it. He wrote it the way he had learned to write things for the Accord, precisely, without emotional appeal, calibrated to the frameworks that would make it legible to alien minds. He documented the hardship accurately. He documented the failure points. He documented the suffering that was real and ongoing, and that would continue for years regardless of what decision the council made. And then he documented what the suffering was also producing. He submitted it on day 96 and went back to his quarters, which no longer had a lock on the door, and sat by the small viewport in his room and looked at the stars. Una Park came by that evening. She didn't say much. She brought food she'd apparently been quietly stockpiling because that was the kind of person she was, and they ate together looking out at the fleet formations, which had shifted again. This time outward, the inner arc expanding by almost 30 degrees. They're giving us room, Una said. They're deciding, Merck said. What do you think they'll decide? He was quiet for a moment. I think they'll decide that what they thought they were managing isn't what they were managing. I think they'll start asking questions they don't know how to ask, and I think it will take them a long time to understand the answers. Is that a win? He thought about the people in Hokkaido, the engineers in the Baltic, the communities in Lagos and Sao Paulo and Chennai who had found, under the pressure of an unprecedented withdrawal, not collapse but something older, something that had been there all along under the surface of integration, waiting, the way root systems wait through the cold. He thought about Riku Tanaka, who he had never met, in an apartment in Osaka, saying to 11 people, I think we should talk about what comes next. He thought about what it meant that no one had told them to do that. No one had organized it or commanded it or issued a directive. It had simply happened because humans, given a new environment, do not wait for instructions. I don't know if it's a win, he said honestly. I know it's true. I know what's happening is true, and it's going to keep being true regardless of what the council decides, because we didn't do this for the council. We didn't do this at the council or against the council or because of the council. He paused. We did this because this is what we do. When something stops working, we build something else. When something is taken away, we find out what we have without it. When something hurts enough, we get very, very focused. Yuna was quiet for a while. You know what the scary part is, she said eventually. Tell me. We don't think of ourselves as scary. She looked at the fleet formations. All those ships from all those civilizations positioned in careful arcs around a small yellow sun. We just think of it as being human. Merk looked at the ships too. Somewhere behind him, on the other side of a door that no longer had a lock on it, the Accord Council was reviewing his report and beginning to understand something they had never encountered before in 4,000 years of managing developing civilizations. Something that didn't have a category in their frameworks, didn't have a historical parallel in their records, and couldn't be resolved by any of the tools they'd built for situations like this. Something that defied the core assumption that made their entire project of galactic governance coherent, that a civilization, sufficiently contained, becomes manageable. They had built the containment. They had built it carefully, humanely, by their own lights responsibly. They had positioned their fleets and revoked the licenses and removed the access and locked the doors. And what they were discovering, 96 days later, was that the thing they had contained was not the thing they thought they were containing. They had thought they were containing humanity's power. They had not understood that humanity's power was not a thing that could be held in the structures they'd helped build or stripped away when those structures were removed. It was not in the manufacturing licenses or the FTL access or the Accord economic networks. It was not something that had been given to them. It was in the person in Osaka who called 11 neighbors and said, without any authority to do so, without any organization behind her and any plan in front of her, I think we should talk about what comes next. It was in the engineers who, without knowing about each other, arrived at the same design. It was in the communities that turned out to be more themselves without the overlay than with it. It was in every human being who had, without being asked, decided that what comes after collapse is not absence, but something new, something built from what remains, which is always more than the people trying to contain you believe is there. The stars had united to strip humanity of power, and humanity had looked at the space left behind and started building in it. The Accord would never quite recover from understanding this, not because humans were stronger or more advanced or more right, but because the galaxy had just discovered that there exists a kind of species that is not made more manageable by difficulty, that does not trend towards stillness when stillness is enforced, that cannot be fully contained by removing what it has, because what it has was never the point. The point was always what it does, and what it does not require permission. Merk solely sat by his small viewport and watched the fleet formations hold their patient, careful position around his son, and felt something that was not quite triumph and not quite grief and not quite hope, something older than all of those, something that didn't have a clean name in any language, alien or human, because it was the feeling of a species recognizing itself in a mirror it didn't know it had. Out there on the other side of that careful fleet, 93 days of pressure had produced something that would take decades to fully map. The roots were already in the ground. The structure was already in place, not the structure anyone had planned or announced or organized into existence, but the structure that emerges when you remove everything else and discover what was always underneath. The Accord would write reports about this. They would hold sessions and revise frameworks and adjust their developmental assessment protocols to account for the anomaly. They would be thorough about it, and careful, and genuinely interested in understanding. They would never quite get there, because the thing they were trying to understand was not an anomaly. It was not a special case or an edge condition or a variable that had been underweighted in their models. It was a species that had learned, before it ever left its own atmosphere, that no condition is permanent, no structure is final, no loss is the last word. A species that had metabolized extinction-level events so many times that the metabolization had become biological, cultural, neurological, as fundamental to being human as language or laughter or the specific, bewildering way they love things they know they are going to lose. The galaxy's oldest civilizations had decided Earth was not ready. Earth had heard this and gone to work, and somewhere in Osaka, A woman the Accord had never heard of and would never meet was sitting at a table with more people than last time, because the table had gotten larger, because tables do that when you let humans sit around them long enough.